Hello and welcome everyone. My name is Julia Charlton and I'm the Chair of the Commonwealth Chamber of Commerce. Thank you so much for joining us today and tuning in the morning, afternoon or evening, depending on where you are. We appreciate you taking the time out of your busy day to be with us today. So the subject of the webinar is special and it's an area that we haven't really focused on before, but it's important and interesting. Today we're talking about education planning, specifically the financial planning and costs analysis needed to reach children's and young people's academic goals in pursuing higher education at their dream university or further education institute, perhaps outside of their home country. So this subject is critical for all individuals, considering it's one of the most important milestones in many people's lives, and certainly in many young people's lives, to actually go to university or have further education. So this can be a transformative journey that defines the kind of experiences that people will end up going through in their professional careers and the career paths that they will end up taking. And at the same time, we're all aware, especially with rising costs and inflation at the moment, of the increased cost of these kinds of institutions and the huge competition to get into them, despite the fact that apparently there are over 50% more further education establishments today than were around 20 years ago even. So it's no surprise that surveys such as the HSBC's 2018 Value of Education report showcase that half or more of the respondents from across the world feel financially unprepared and don't know when is the best time to start saving for their and their children's post-secondary education. So today we will be providing some valuable insights on all the ins and outs of financial planning that are needed to pursue goals of paying for higher education without having to make huge sacrifices to quality of life. And we'll do this with a specific view through the lens of the Commonwealth countries, with their rich historical heritage of shared systems of law, in some cases even similar approaches to education systems. So the Commonwealth includes countries renowned for world-class universities, including the UK, Australia, Canada and Malaysia, among others, and that have a significant presence in the world's top-rated university rankings. So Commonwealth people make up approximately a sixth of the entire student body pursuing further education internationally, which is partly also because of the advantages of intra-Commonwealth scholarship and studentship opportunities. So joining me to discuss how to navigate the current academic arena and step by step how to craft the best plan of action based on financial standing and academic objectives is Paul Jeffries, a consultant at Lawson's Wealth. Paul brings a huge amount of experience in international financial services. He's had a 35-year career across various domains, including private banking, wealth management, financial advice and financial planning. And Paul has a diverse client base across the Commonwealth, including people from Commonwealth Asia, Africa and the Caribbean states, and he specialises in helping people find academic opportunities for prestigious universities across the Commonwealth and beyond. And he has a great business acumen, having sold 10 companies. He's qualified with the UK Chartered Insurance Institute, the Hong Kong Confederation of Insurance Brokers, and the Singapore Institute of Banking and Finance. So Paul, it's lovely to have you here with me today. I understand that you're going to give a short presentation, which we're looking forward to. So Paul, over to you.
Julia, thank you. Thank you very much. How do I live up to such a fantastic introduction? Thank you very much for that. And yeah, good afternoon to everybody out there. I'm speaking to you from Dubai. So I'm 2 o'clock approximately in the afternoon. So I'm hoping I'm in a suitable time zone for you all. I'd just like to start, if I may, by giving you a very brief background. I don't want to talk too much about me. I want very much to add value today and try my level best to provide you with as much information as I can. But a little background of me. So I'm a true offshore individual. Not sure that's a phrase that we use too much today, but I was born in Guernsey, the Channel Islands, and I spent the first 10 years of my career in the Channel Islands. I then moved away to Europe for a period, and then I spent most of my adult life in the Far East, Malaysia, Singapore, Hong Kong. My wife is from the Philippines, so I've also spent some time there. And now I find myself in the last few years working very much out of Mauritius into Africa and now the Middle East. So I've got an extensive background, I'd like to think, in the international space. I've dealt with a large number of individuals across a large number of Commonwealth countries and continue to do so. And I'd like to think that I've accumulated over the last 35, 36 years a wealth of information that, if nothing more, I can pass on to individuals. Martina, if you wouldn't mind going to the next slide, that would be helpful. So on to perhaps my passion, and that's serving with education. And even though today's topic is very much about education, secondary, tertiary, overseas, etc., I think my whole approach to financial services is about education. And I feel today that I can probably add more value from the information that I can provide. And in many ways, the disseminating of information, given that we have access to so much of it these days, it's putting it in a format that makes sense, and everybody that I deal with walks away, growing with a learning experience to a point where they feel very comfortable with the actions they take and the products and services they might use. I think also serving with education to me is today key. I deal with clients from as far south as Australia, New Zealand, to as far north as China, as far east and west as you can go. In most cases, dealing in the Commonwealth, but sometimes outside of that. And I often get asked questions related to today's topic. What do I do about education for my children? How do I send them to the best schools, universities in the world? Can I do that as a non-resident in those countries? And how can you help? And I tend to work with clients as a full turnkey solution from start to finish. I will not pretend today that I am the all things to all men and I have all the information, but I certainly have all the contacts required to provide the information from a single source. So I would say that if anybody was interested to talk to me directly, sometimes we go off piste from my expertise, but I bring somebody in who has the relevant skills, if that's helpful. We could go to the next slide, Martina, would be helpful. And that leads me to this collaboration today. Kindly, Julia, Martina, and team. I've discussed over the months with them the sort of services I provide, which are education driven, as opposed to, I think, most of the businesses out there, which are very much sales driven. And I think we decided that a collaboration such as an event today would be very helpful to Commonwealth Chamber of Commerce members and any other attendees that wanted to join us to hear what we had to say. And I believe Julia has a whole host of questions for me, which I look forward to answering very shortly, which should bring me to my last slide of the introduction. School fee planning. School fee planning is a very broad subject, and it does require, I believe, somebody with qualified skills, somebody who can help, an African wanting to be educated outside of Africa, an Asian wanting to be educated outside of Asia, or, a whole multitude of what comes with that. I've met recently an Indian gentleman whose children were studying in South Africa, but he wanted to send them to university in the UK. There's a lot of cross borders there that requires not just education planning, but also visas and all other things that are required in order to bring that together. So that's something hopefully we can discuss more today. And I think school fee planning is probably the key to the conversation, because ultimately we need to be able to afford what it is that we want to achieve. You know, our objectives need to be affordable, and to me that means starting, you know, as soon as possible, wherever that might be in your cycle. So that hopefully will come up in a bit more detail when Julia asks me questions a little later. So that's really my background, very, very quickly, and how I'd like to assist you today if I'm able to. And I believe the recording of this video will be available. So feel free, once the webinar is complete, we can send that to everybody for further review. And of course, you'll have all our details and you can ask us questions as and when required. So that's my introduction. Maybe if I can go back to you, Julia.
So thank you very much for that brief overview. That was very helpful, Paul. Thank you. So let's dive into talking about your life and work. So how long have you actually been doing helping people to find their futures at universities and further education institutions? Yeah. And how did you get interested in this in the first place?
Yeah, well, you know, when you decide to come into, let's say, the financial advisory stroke planning world, you tend to do that by some on-the-ground training as well as certain levels of formal education. I started actually using the Chartered Insurance Institute in the UK. That was the first step I took, which then led me on to both the Chartered Institute for Securities and Investment, the Hong Kong regulators and the Singapore regulators. But I think, you know, the first step, if you like, in financial planning is always about protection. The second step is always about saving for the future. Third step is retirement, and then on to investment. And I think I've always been intrigued about the savings element, because I met a gentleman once who had been in this profession for a number of years, and he was mentoring me, and I asked him, you know, if you had one piece of advice for me, what would it be? And he said, Paul, I believe every single person on the planet ought to have a savings strategy. Nobody's got too much money that they ought not to have a savings strategy. And I remember walking away from that thinking to myself, yeah, I just can't think of an angle to disagree with him. And I think that's kind of where it started for me. And I think, you know, there are stats, and obviously statistics are not always reliable, but there are stats around various countries that you can glean over the years. You know, some of the most sophisticated, shall we say, developed countries like a UK have stats where only 30% of the population are saving. You can look at countries like Malaysia, and it's something like 5% of the population. And so, to my mind, I always felt that it was very important to take on board the promotion of savings, and to, you know, and here's a lovely bit of information for you. If you were to, and this is not related to saving in terms of any particular goal, but I'll use this because it's quite useful. If you were to save an amount of money for a child for the first 2 years of their life and left that money there, taking a balanced investment approach until they were age 65, but versus an individual saving from the age of 30 to 65, the child's savings in just those 2 years would have a greater return because of compound interest. And to me, therefore, the answer is one must start saving as soon as possible.
Absolutely. Yeah. So how does what you do interface with insurance at the moment in terms of school fee planning? Is there much interface there?
Well, you know, there are many ways to skin the cat.
Yeah.
And, you know, I think it requires proper planning approach, and, you know, doing a confidential risk profiled financial questionnaire with a client so that you understand their circumstances, their background, their future objectives, goals, etc., can give, you know, a strong idea as to then what and how you might position things. And, I think in the world of AI, as we're in at the moment, a lot of people are talking to me about Chat GPT and saying,
Yeah.
can your role perhaps be replaced by, an AI robot? And I think to an extent, maybe, but I think the reality of that is, in my experience, everybody's circumstances are different. So pulling information off of, Google's database and bringing together a plan based on that, it would work if you're putting a square peg in a square hole, but not if you're putting a round peg in a square hole.
Yeah. I'm sure all of AI
So it starts with,
can sort of enhance what you're doing with your added expertise. I think that's how I would see things like that.
yeah, no, absolutely. But I think, it starts with a proper understanding of the individual. And I think insurance, still to this day, I would say that one of the hardest jobs I have day to day is convincing a family to think stronger about the protection of their family versus the savings that they might make. I think it's a natural propensity to want to save the best you can without having to pay for, what's perceived still as a negative purchase in insurance. But I think the balance needs to be got right, because at the end of the day, that saving will not continue and you won't hit your objectives if a untimely demise was to prevent that from occurring, and in particular if they didn't have the right protection.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. So coming back to the exact subject of financial planning for education, and why do you think a family would decide to think about trying to send a child, a teenager, overseas to study versus studying locally where they live, perhaps?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, today there's a number of ways to answer that, but I think from as crudely as prestige through to the perception that these old, well-established institutions, provide better education. I have to say, I'm not somebody who fully subscribes to that. It doesn't mean that the education would be better, but I think still the perception is there. Before the webinar, I did a little bit of research, and in the top 10 universities in the world currently, I think there's 5 of those still happen to be in the UK. And they would be, those institutions that you would think of, Oxford, Cambridge, and the likes. And I think, I'm quite proud of that being obviously of British origin, but equally, as you mentioned at the beginning, there are some fantastic universities in Canada, Australia, Malaysia, Singapore, Hong Kong. I've just spent the last 12 months of my life living and working out of Mauritius. And there's a Middlesex University there. I used to use the university's gym. I'm a keen weightlifter, and I spent all my time with all these youngsters in the gym from the university. And I was quite amazed. There were individuals there from France, from the UK, from various locations in Africa, Ghana, Tanzania, Kenya, some from Malaysia, because there's a small Chinese population also in Mauritius. And I was quite amazed how diverse it was. So I think
a real Commonwealth story, really. And of course, French speaking as well, hence the French there.
Yeah. So, I think to come back to that point, prestige still seems to be very much high up there, but I think it's also the perception that, universities in the UK have stood the test of, 200 or 300 years versus the new university. And as you may have noticed, a lot of the universities today get strong relationships with the old established institutions. So Mauritius, again, is a good example. That's Mauritius's Middlesex University and the likes.
Yeah, very entrepreneurial of Middlesex University, I must say.
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah, actually Sunderland University has quite a big campus in Hong Kong. So, and I think one of the largest alumni and groups in Hong Kong is from Edinburgh Napier University. So, you know, there's some quite unusual, well, names you wouldn't immediately think of educational institutions that are actually doing very well overseas outside their home countries. Yeah. So,
Yeah, and I think
yeah,
similarly,
sorry.
though, you know, and I'll go back to Mauritius because it's quite a useful one.
Yeah.
You know, Mauritius is a very unique culture in that it had a huge number of Indian immigrants 100 years plus ago,
Yeah,
and also has a strong French and English connection.
Yes, yes.
And because of that, you know, a lot of students in Mauritius will go to one of those three countries for university, either India, France, or the UK.
Yes, yeah.
But I think the UK still seems to come out on top, although I've seen more people aiming at probably Australia and Canada.
Right, right. New Zealand, do you come across that?
Yeah, a little bit. I don't know if it's the distance that puts people off, but they seem to end up in Australia more so.
Right, right, yeah, yeah. So what's the average cost, or, you know, the range of costs of going to an overseas educational establishment?
Yeah, that. I'll speak in terms of sterling because of the UK for a moment, but I can easily translate that. You know, whichever way you weigh things up, obviously there's always the elite end of university, and then there's always what would be the lower cost universities. But if I work around what I'd say is the average, you know, the medium for this, the UK still to this day, the cost of university is probably between £8,000 and £12,000 a year for the course. So if we work on 10 to make life easy for us, it's going to cost around about the same amount again for accommodation.
Yeah.
Right. And ordinarily, it's going to cost the same amount again for general living expense.
Yeah.
Now, I'm a proud father of a 19-year-old who's currently studying at Royal Holloway, just outside Windsor in the UK. He's a budding musician. And I can tell you that I've budgeted for a 3-year course of approximately £100,000.
Mm-hmm.
And so that would translate to maybe $125,000 for putting him through university in its entirety. Now, even though obviously I'm British, because I do live in the Middle East, and he does come back to visit me, that does also include the cost of 2 to 3 flights to me return a year as well. So I would say, if you worst case said, you know, £100,000 a year or $125,000, sorry, not a year, in total for a 3-year course.
Yeah.
That's going to be approximately the right way to look at it.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, that can scale up if it was to be one of the more prestigious universities, you know, the top 2 or 3 in the world, like your Oxfords and Cambridges, notwithstanding, of course, a conversation around scholarship, which is quite often the case with those universities. But I would say that is a fair assumption.
Or studying medicine, for example, would be more expensive and longer, right?
Yes, and as you would know, law similarly, or some of the other professions like veterinary services, and similar.
Thank you.
Yes, they tend to be 3 to 5 year courses, don't they?
Yeah, yeah. And Australia, similar price? Canada, are they similar?
It's still not far away, you know.
Right, right.
Still not far away.
Mm.
I think, you know, you have to balance out the cost of getting there, the cost of living there, the cost of the course. And unfortunately, the universities that most people seem to enjoy are in city areas, and that tends not to be low cost.
Yeah, absolutely, yes. So when do you think families should start to think about financial planning if they're thinking about possible overseas education for their young people?
Yeah, you know, I've met a family just the last week or so, and they weren't massively different to myself, actually.
Mm.
You know, I have a 9-year-old, a 12-year-old, and a 19-year-old. I started saving for the 19-year-old the day he was born. In fact, my parents, his grandparents, started an account for him prior to him arriving. And I think that demonstrates it's never too early.
Yes, yes.
I've always been a advisor who believes in not necessarily always saving absolutely matching up product with objective specific. What I mean by that is I often meet families or couples who want to save for retirement, who want to save for education, who want to save for a house, may even want to save for a car. And what we tend to do is plan around getting the savings started, and that, as long as it's structured in a way that has certain levels of flexibility, accessibility, portability, if they move to another country, they can keep it going, and so forth, then that can be used for any future eventuality. Obviously, with a bit of management to make sure that it doesn't get depleted before certain goals. But I think where that's helpful is that I meet people who don't yet have children, but then convert that savings plan that they put in place for something into earmark for school education once the child arrives.
Yeah.
And I think it's probably worth saying that, to my mind, if you have less than 10 years to save, i.e. your child is perhaps, and we're talking, let's say university, and university starts at the typical age of, say, 18. So obviously the child is no older than 8. Then I think you can save with a strong element of investment, which could help you outperform and then therefore create greater sums into the future. I think if you've got less than 10 years to save, then you have to be a little bit more careful how you put whatever together, because being too aggressive with the investment element with such a short time to go doesn't necessarily always give you the
you've got to go
ability
through the cycles, haven't you? So what types of investment would you be suggesting people should consider for that type of saving?
Yeah, well, there are short-term saving structures, there are deposit type structures, there are lump sum type structures, and all the above can be put together. I helped a lady recently where I think the son was 15, and what was clear to me was that she wasn't a particularly good saver. So I said to her, look, we don't have any time to speculate, and therefore, we can't lose any of your money, so we can't invest it as such, but let's open a dedicated savings account, and you have to put a certain amount in it every month from your monthly salary for the next 3 years. And so that's what we've done. And here's a nice little statistic for you. Not that I particularly use insurance-based products, but it was an insurance company, Sun Life of Canada, who did a stat that said the average 15-year savings strategy that they put together, only 2% ever make it to maturity. And because of that, I tend to say to people, look, the real key to saving is not about the gains you might make. It's about the fact that you wouldn't have saved otherwise. If I said, put X, Y, Z in a tin under your bed every month for the next 15 years, I don't think I've ever met a human being that could possibly do it. Because at some stage, there'd be a reason to dip into it, and before you know it, it's gone.
Yeah.
But if you save it as a dedicated saving, even if you only got back the amount that it saved and nothing more, it would have been beneficial because you wouldn't have saved it otherwise.
Yes, yeah. Quite right. So are there any tax benefits or tax planning that can be used? I suppose it depends where people are located, does it?
Yeah, well, I would ordinarily, because of my background, offshore, and I hate that phrase really, international, I'd prefer to use.
Yes.
I would tend to use what are flexible international plans. And I'll use another scenario if that's helpful. So I was dealing with a young couple in Nigeria recently, and they'd said to me that they'd suffered losses because of the Nigerian naira currency. They said that they were a bit worried about a new incumbent government, what that might mean to their savings. So it was a little bit unsettling for them, and they wanted to make sure that no matter what happened economically or even socially or politically, that their future savings wasn't diminished in any way. So they chose to use an international structure. So, whether you're based in India, whether you're based in Malaysia, whether you're based in Nigeria or anywhere, I would recommend to save into an international structure, which would allow you to save into one of the major international currencies, which of course is very helpful. And let's go back to UK. If you plan to send your child to university in the UK, then it would make total sense to save in pound sterling, so you don't have any worries about future foreign exchange issues. And those structures tend to be offshore. So what that means is they're not taxable, the growth won't be taxable, and therefore they are tax efficient.
Right.
To answer your question.
Yeah.
And they allow you to pay directly from that structure into the university or into a bank account, so that you don't have to literally liquidate the investment at the time of requirement. You just draw down from it what you need and let the remainder continue to grow.
Yeah. Thank you. So there's just a few questions have come in, so perhaps I'll just look at those for a minute. So here's a question. Are there any universities in Canada or Malaysia that allow students to work while they study to make the expenses easier? I don't know if you know that detail.
I would say all of them. I mean, I keep trying to encourage my son, who finds it easier to make money busking than to get a job.
He's a musician. Don't be so hard on him, Paul.
But he's made some fantastic money busking. But the reality is,
so what instrument does he play, by the way?
He's actually doesn't play well. He can play the drums, but he's known for his singing.
I see.
Yeah, he's a singer. So he takes his music, and a microphone. But he would be in the minority. I think virtually all students today have, should we call it, a side hustle, and that's certainly not frowned upon. Definitely Australia, Canada, UK, and other locations, set things up in certain ways where students are given concessions from a tax perspective, and there's certainly no taxes to pay on their income unless they were to make, obscene amounts of money from whatever they were doing. So absolutely. Yeah,
okay, that's interesting to know. Right. Next question. How much percentage on average do consultants charge? I suppose they mean for this type of education planning.
Yeah, great question as well. There's various ways to cover that. So some structures are, so if you take an insurance structure, that is fully embedded with a fee structure for which an advisor like myself would be remunerated. So you don't, as a client, have to pay me anything. I get paid by the provider. As you probably know today, all of that is very transparent. So, when we go through the process, I would then show the full charging structure of such a scheme, and it would outline what the charges are, where they're applied, how they're applied, and who benefits from those charges. Excuse me. I use other strategies where I am quite the opposite end of that scale, where it's a fee-based strategy. So I literally work maybe a little bit like a lawyer, and I charge a time-based approach.
Right.
And I think, what I like the most is the fact that it tends to be bespoke. I work with people in such a way that it becomes affordable based on their circumstances. So I try to build a plan so that obviously I can help. Like an example would be in the UK today, advisors such as myself can literally only earn a living by a fee-based approach. And whilst I don't see anything wrong with that, the obvious problem with that is that it means that a large number of individuals can't afford advice.
Right. Yes. Yeah. It actually deprives them of advice. Yeah.
Yeah. So I believe in, having a more flexible approach so that I can help people. But the fact is, great question. And anyone listening, somebody like myself or anybody that you choose to work with, you must ask them up front the same question, and make sure that anything that you do is fully outlined to you before.
I guess, Paul, you're not really answering their question there, which was how much percentage on average to consultants charge?
Well, yeah, that's a very difficult one, because
I bet it is. Is there a range?
I would have said, you see, the thing is with regular saving, which is what you would ordinarily do over a long period of time. And I'll give you an example. Somebody who saves, let me just think about this. I think off the top of my head, if somebody saves $1,500 a month for 15 years, they should end up with growth roughly at the 100,000 or 125,000 US that I mentioned just now. In order to pay an individual like me, they normally give us a percentage of every payment that's made. And that could be anything from, I think, 1% to 7%, depending on the structure.
Yeah.
But if I meet a client and they've only got 5 years to go, and I'm recommending they put it in a bank account, I might not charge them anything when near that. And it might be, $100 for my time, because it took me an hour to put it together.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you. Thanks. So here's another question. Which countries are more friendly with their visa permanent resident requirements for students? For instance, if the parents want to move with their children while they're studying?
Very good question. I mean, again, Australia.
Asian parents in particular sometimes want to go and make sure they settle in a bit, don't they?
Yeah. Again, it comes back to a process. I mean, I would say the three I've mentioned before, Australia, UK, Canada, would be highly open to that. They want diverse populations in their universities. I read a stat the other day that 30% of all UK applicants are coming from outside the UK. But there's a process there, and that starts not necessarily by talking to immigration. It starts by talking to the university, and the university then at the admissions level are normally fantastic at working very closely with families in order to help achieve what they're trying to achieve. But I would say to you that it starts with the student, and if the student is accepted by the university in principle, that's stage one. And then in order to come, I need to come with this approach, i.e. mother, father, sister, family, whatever it might be. Then it comes from there. But I would say all is achievable. It just needs, again, some planning.
Yeah.
And I think probably worth answering the other end of the scale of that, and what happens after university.
Yes.
And whether the individual wants to stay, let's say, in the UK, because as you know today, a lot of the universities are promoting themselves as campuses that are well known for great numbers in terms of helping students get jobs.
Yeah, although somebody told me today, I don't know how true this is, they told me over lunch that even Wharton, business school, one of the world's best business schools, a lot of the graduates this year don't think they can find jobs. So I guess it just, doing an MBA program, so I suppose it just depends on the market at the time, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think the small print course always covers that, but I think still, that seems to be a very strong measure of the success of the university. And then key is, if that is an overseas student, can they take up these positions? And again, I I say yes. I don't think there's any rules precluding individuals in that way, and I think certainly those three countries are very pro bringing the students through into jobs. But it does, of course, need some forward thinking, and if you want family to stay, then that's, you know, we're now slightly moving into visa conversations. But again, I could always help make the right introductions.
Yeah.
You know, so
Thank you.
never, yeah, nothing is impossible, I would say, in that area.
Right. So here's another question. I want to help my brother study in Hong Kong, but the applications are hard to understand sometimes, like all those personal statements and stuff. Do you have help with academic aspects, or do you have contacts who can help with that?
Yeah, I certainly would say I don't have the expertise, but I know people who can help.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And would you recommend that people do get that kind of help with the application process?
Yeah, I think so. You know, sometimes, I mean, you know, in Hong Kong, for example, these documents are written in both Cantonese and English. But if neither is a strong language, or even for an English speaker, for example, it can still be a little bit cumbersome. So yeah, there are people on the ground there that can help. And I can certainly make introductions.
Right. So another one, how popular is India when it comes to education? Africans seem to prefer Indian universities due to various fees, subsidy, scholarships provided to them. That's just a question somebody's posted.
Yeah. Well, as I mentioned earlier, I've experienced that firsthand from Mauritius. And actually, I met a guy, I think he was from Uganda, who'd come to Mauritius, and he was doing not a gap year, he was doing a, I can't think of the phrase now, but he was taking a year out from Mauritius and he was going to Mumbai. Yeah, I think, you know, dare I mention a country outside the Commonwealth, but I think there is some, you know, a larger amount of people looking to what they would deem as lower cost zones. And I think India would definitely be one of those. You know, fantastic infrastructure in many of the cities, some very good old universities, and very open to international students. So absolutely, I think it's happening more and more.
Right, right. So how do you really educate people who talk to you on the potential return on investment and the long-term financial benefits of studying abroad? Or do you think people have already made up their mind that they want their children to study abroad when they talk to you?
Yeah, you know, I do think probably the latter. I think I don't think I've entered too many conversations where I've been coaching people to think about overseas education as such.
Yeah.
I think they've already thought about it, and then
So by definition, when they come and talk to you, yeah, so they're already quite motivated, aren't they? So
yeah.
do you think that people are looking for scholarship opportunities and so on? And can you point them in the right direction about scholarships, grants, financial aid options, as well as the money that they've put together themselves?
Yeah. That probably would be my weakest point in the conversation. Again, I can pass on to the right people. There are, you know, in the various locations, there are always businesses that can help that area. With past feedback, I would say, though, however, one of the most positive first steps would be to connect with a chosen university, who often will take on board a lot of that work and help with that area themselves.
Yeah. So did you see a lot of impact of COVID and the pandemic on your business and international education? And were there particular problems that came up, and were there strategies you had to use to address these, or how did all of that work?
Yeah, you know, I think people who have, you know, made the commitment, should we say, to want to send their children overseas, I think they saw COVID as a short-term issue. and therefore didn't really change at all. Yeah, I don't think people were particularly impacted in their mindset. I think, you know, this is short term. I'll continue with my plans, or this is short term. I mean, the only thing that probably impacted it was those who were kind of, you know, in the midst of conversation.
Yes.
And they probably said, you know what, I'm not sure what's happening with my income. I think I better sit tight until I've got some clarity.
Yes, yes. I also felt very sorry for students who, you know, spent years looking forward to going to university and then maybe ended up sitting at home doing, you know, 1 or 2 years of their university life online. That wasn't much fun for them, I think.
No, absolutely. My son was delighted because he was just finishing his A levels, and he ended up with some fantastic results. And he said to me, "I'm not sure I'd have got them if they hadn't used the averages." So I think he was one of those that benefited from it. But yeah, you know, I think I probably had, as an impact of COVID, more conversations than I've ever had. Because I think people had a bit more time and they were a bit more open to, you know, people who just wouldn't have gone on Zoom and Teams in the past were happy to come on and try it and get used to it. So I probably had more conversations than ever.
Are they fruitful conversations? Did that work, do you think?
They are starting to be now. Yes, yeah. Certainly people were sitting a little on the fence until clarity returned, and of course travel, and people go and, you know, because I think virtually nobody goes to a university without going to see it first, and certainly often with their family, parents, etc. So now that's all resumed, then I think it's very much, I'd say, beyond business as usual.
Right, that's interesting. But have you carried on doing more of the online stuff as well as a result of the COVID experience?
Yeah, you know, I would say in many ways, there's more opportunity for me now to do a sort of global approach to the business than there's ever been.
Than there's ever been, you know? Interesting.
Because we can do this sort of thing.
Yes, absolutely. And it wouldn't have been normal 5 years ago, I think, would it? It would have been a bit, you know, everyone would have thought, well, I'd rather go to a physical event, but now they'd probably rather watch something online.
And in particular, I would say at the slightly older age group, you know, anybody sort of maybe 70 plus who just, you know, would have shied away from technology. I'm now having conversations with them. And of course, they're wanting to save for, say, grandchildren.
Absolutely. So, yeah. So how do you stay up to date on the latest trends and changes in, you know, international education and financial planning?
Yeah. Well, as you alluded to, I'm still a member of the Chartered Institute.
Yes.
And as part of the Chartered Institute's makeup, we still continue to do 35 hours a year of continued professional development. So, you know, that's a couple of hours a month, 3 hours a month that we continue to do.
That's a lot, isn't it?
It is, yeah. Yeah, but actually they put on some really fascinating one, and sometimes I'll do a whole day thing so it's 9 hours in one go. So it's not quite as bad as that. But I also, you know, keep up to date because being a consultant, I'm not tied to any particular company. So I choose the go-to institutions to gain and glean information. And they are in various locations because obviously that's also important. So I'd say I probably read a couple of hours most days of various information that comes into me, from snapshots to full blurbs on anything from property to AI to education to investment, stock markets, and anything in between. And then some specialist subjects, you know, like international visas, golden visas, overseas property purchasing, because I get a lot of people from Africa asking me, can we buy property in the UK?
Yes,
that sort of thing.
Yeah.
So, you know, we cover all of that. I'm an avid investor myself. I don't tend to recommend anything that I wouldn't ordinarily invest in. So obviously I like to keep up to date. There's a vested interest.
That's good. That's very good. Put your money where your mouth is. Right. Excellent.
Yeah.
So can you tell us a couple of success stories of people you actually helped, over a period of time who went on to study successfully?
Yeah, yeah. Actually, I'd like to, if I may, start with my own personal
Sure.
story, because I
Yeah.
think that's quite useful. My son. Well, we were living in Singapore at the time, so my son popped out 2 months premature. But of course, we did know he was on the way, so his grandparents started saving for him way back, and I started saving for him alongside that, as did his other set of grandparents, his on my wife's side. And we continued to use that program when we moved to Hong Kong. The scheme was portable. We'd always thought that he'd go to university in the UK, so we'd set the structure up as a pound plan, even though in those days I was earning in either Singapore dollar or Hong Kong dollar. We moved around a few other times after that, back to Guernsey, to the Middle East, to Africa, back to Guernsey, back to Africa, back to the Middle East, and all the while continued to save into that scheme. We tried our level best to focus on my son working very hard towards great grades and potential scholarships and so forth. And actually, I smile about this in some ways, but he was all along looking to go to a law school. But I had that conversation with him about 3 years ago, and he said to me, "Dad, my passion is music, and I want to be a superstar. I've spoken to Mum, who thinks this. What do you think?" And I said, "I believe that you should always follow your passion." And therefore, he didn't go to law school, and he went to music school, which I smile because that's obviously quite a fair amount cheaper than a law school. But nevertheless.
Is it really? Isn't it a similar price in the UK?
No, I would say
fees are pretty similar in the UK, aren't they?
Yeah, but the difference would be it's a 3 year versus a 5 year.
No, UK's
program.
3 year degree and then 1 year. And no, I mean, there's 3 and 4 year programs, but yeah, I wouldn't say it was hugely different actually, depending on where you study law. Actually,
yeah. So, but I would say to give coming back to kind of where that sort of all started, I think we probably undersaved in hindsight, because we went through markets where we got some lean years and anticipated better returns. And so I currently give him some pocket money on a monthly basis in order to support him, and I'm very much trying to get him to do a bit more busking.
Yes.
But I think it was a success story because he's now at university. I can tell you he is the first member of my family ever in our history to go to university.
Amazing, amazing. So Paul, if we do another event, I think he should appear. He should, he should be doing the singing at the beginning or the end. Okay.
Okay. Well, he's just launched his 3rd single on Spotify, and he seems to be going in the right direction. So
what's
maybe.
His name?
Well, his stage name is Oscar Armenta.
Oscar Armenta. Okay.
Yeah, his family name actually is Armenta-Jeffries.
Right.
So he goes by
very
Oscar
exotic
Armenta.
name. Okay, cool. I'll look.
Yeah, his mum's Mexican.
Right.
Yeah.
So any other non-family stories you'd like to tell us about success stories?
Yeah. Well, this involves actually a guy with a lovely background. So he is half Indian and half Mauritian. And actually his Mauritian half is half Indian, half French.
Yes.
So he's a nice mixture. And this youngster was introduced to me before I moved to Mauritius, actually. He's now 22 or 23. And he was very keen in sport. Yes. In fact, he wanted to be a footballer. And he gained a scholarship, actually, to Adelaide University. And it's interesting because nobody's actually saved for him for long. But what actually happened was he got this scholarship, but he knew that wasn't going to be enough for expenses, etc., etc. So his family approached me, and we were able to put a plan in place. One, actually, when the Mauritian government realised that what he was hoping to do, they gave him a certain level of grant, but also his grandparents then made an investment. Now, I might get this wrong, but it was either only 6 or 7 years, so it wasn't a long period of time, but they placed a lump sum of money. And from that lump sum of money, the idea was to create an income that then would pay for the school without potentially touching the capital. And they actually would maintain the money. It would be their money, but the income that came from it would fund him. And that's what they did. And in fact, he didn't make it as a footballer, which was his chosen desire, but he's now a full-time personal trainer.
Cool.
And so part of his studies in Adelaide was not only the sports that he was doing, but it was also towards a physical training instructor's qualification, which he got, and he continues to train and do that. So yeah, fantastic. And in fact, I said to him when I moved there, it'd be lovely for him to do some training. We never got to that, but I think fantastic to think that in some ways all these obscure locations have come together.
Yes. Yes.
And now he's got a future.
So that's a great story. So and what about one that didn't work out? Somebody you helped maybe where it didn't work out the way you'd hoped, or the way they had hoped?
Yeah, I think there's too many of those actually. And I could put it down to one thing, and it was the inability to continue to save.
Right.
Many stories I can talk about where people had to, some did it through the need for immediate gratification for a shiny object. Others did it because the financial situations precluded them. Many were related to perhaps breakups in parental relationships, and then the child suffered because of that, because they didn't plan for it, or the finances, of course, changed dramatically as a result. So that would be, I would say, the number one reason. Right.
Okay.
But I think that really is important to say as well. Affordability.
Yes.
I tend to believe that you should never try, unless you're very wealthy, you should never try to save more than about 30% of your monthly income.
Mm-hmm.
And as Warren Buffett says, pay yourself first. Don't go through your month paying all your bills and then save what's left. You put your XYZ away right at the beginning of the month, and then you budget to live on the remainder.
Yes. So what do you think the main advantage of having somebody like you involved is? Is it motivation for people and discipline that it helps them with, and clarity of thought? Or what would you say was the main key benefit that you can add to this journey?
Yeah, nicely put, actually. I think coaching, mentoring is a very strong part of it, keeping people on track so they don't dip into it. And I think the coaching around a conversation that always tends to occur, I need some money, can I get from my savings? And going back into a kind of questionnaire type of conversation where we find other ways to find affordability than to break down what might help with the future objective. But I think also it's there's tons of information out there, going back to the AI point earlier, tons and tons of information out there. Whether one can get through the quagmire and make some sense of it is a different matter. And this might sound a little bit elitist, but I would say that I tend to have worked over the years with people who haven't got the time, haven't got the access, and haven't got the inclination.
Right.
They might be too busy.
Yes. Yeah.
So they need somebody else to do it for them.
beneficial for them to interact with you. Well, thank you very much, Paul. I can't believe an hour's gone by, so thank you so much. And
Likewise.
thanks to everyone who sent in questions. So we've reached the end, and I'd like to thank everyone for joining today, making this event a success. I'm sure Paul would be very happy to hear from anybody who is joined. And if you have any difficulty contacting him, do shoot us an email at the Commonwealth Chamber. So I think his expertise and experience, which he shared with us, and some of his practical strategies have really helped in people thinking about the education of themselves or young people and their families. And I hope that everybody will think about this financial planning journey, and that remember that investing in education is an investment in everybody's future. So thank you so much for joining. And so thank you again, Paul, so much for joining us. And to everyone else who joined, we look forward to seeing you again, and have a great rest of the day or evening wherever you are. Thank you. Bye. Bye.
Thank you for having me, Julia.
Thank
Pleasure.
you. Bye. Bye. Bye.